It's my very real pleasure to introduce this evening's event. This is obviously, as you may have guessed, part of the public programme devoted to our current exhibition, Rose Finn-Kelcey, Life, Belief and Beyond, which is currently in our upper and middle galleries and runs until the 15th of October. The exhibition is the first retrospective of Rose Finn-Kelcey's practice, bringing together around 50 works that together span over 40 years of practice, including some archival and preparatory materials that have not been exhibited before. The exhibition was arranged non-chronologically to explore some of the persistent themes that the artist returned to time and again, such as her explorations of power, political commentary, and perceptions of the self, belief, and spirituality. The exhibition was co-curated by myself and Emma Ridgway, our head of programme here at Modern Art Oxford, together with the close collaboration of Andre Cook, who's the artistic executor of the Rose Finn-Kelcey estate. And Andre joins us here tonight, which we're delighted about. Tonight, artists and writers Kate Elwes, Joe Stockham, Peter Liversidge, Hermione Wiltshire, and Mia Taylor join us to take part in a roundtable discussion that explores the impact of Finn-Kelcey's practice on British contemporary art. The event was really inspired by the artist's multiple roles as an artist, teacher, performer, colleague, and collaborator within the London art world across many decades. And together, our panelists this evening can really bring a remarkable insight into many different aspects of her work from a variety of perspectives on her career. This evening is also an opportunity to reflect on the works included in the exhibition upstairs, but is also a chance to look beyond its scope, with discussions and reflections of many facets of her work, and particularly those works that were simply too large or too technically complicated for us to bring together in this exhibition. So we want to really expand your scope and understanding of the artist's work by talking about some of the things that we haven't been able to show as part of this first retrospective. And as neither Emma nor myself had the privilege of meeting Rose before she passed away in 2014, we really consider tonight to be an important part of the exhibition, to enable you, our audience, to hear from some of her closest friends and collaborators and to gain new insights into her groundbreaking career. The evening will begin with the 5 speakers presenting for around 10 minutes individually, and then the second part of the evening will be a question and answer session facilitated by Emma. And we'll also at that point invite further contributions and questions from the floor, so get your questions ready. Finally, some slightly dull housekeeping. Please turn off your mobile phones or switch them to airplane mode, not because you're going anywhere, but because they actually interfere with our PA system and create a quite horrible feedback, so that's much appreciated. And we're also, as you may have seen, filming this event for our archive, so when you have a question, could you wait for the roving mic to reach you so that we can record your question for posterity. So if you could join me now in welcoming the speakers, and then I'll pass over to Emma to introduce them individually. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. I'm going to introduce each speaker, fairly short, but so you get where they're coming from professionally, and they will then speak for about 10 minutes each. So we're going to start with Kate Elwes. She studied at the Slade School of Art and the Royal College of Art, and she co-curated 2 landmark feminist exhibitions, Women's Image of Men and About Time at the ICA in London. That was in 1980, so well ahead of her time. And from the 1980s, she specialised in video and installation, exploring gender and identity. She's participated in many international festivals, including the British Art Show in Australia and Video Brazil in Sao Paulo, and recent British Video in New York, USA. Her tapes have been shown on Channel 4, as well as on Spanish, Canadian and French television networks. And her work is archived, so you can find it, on Lux Online and Rewind. Kate is the author of Video Loop, which is KT Press 2000, Video Art, a guided tour, 2005, and she's written for publications such as Filmways, Vertigo, Third Text, Contemporary Magazine, and Art Monthly. She's also published in 2005 Installation and the Moving Image, and Landscape and Moving Image. And from 1998 to 2003, she was director of the UK-Canadian Video Exchange, which is a biennial festival that featured video from across Canada and the UK. And in 2006, she co-curated Analog, which was an international exhibition of early video work from the UK, Canada, and Poland. And her most recent curatorial projects have been Figuring Landscape, which is a collection of 55 works. That's on the theme of landscape from the UK and Australia, and that's toured to 11 different venues in both countries from 2008 to 10, as well as Sea Fever, which was in the Finns Terror Festival in Brittany and France. And notably, she's the founding editor of Moving Image Review and Art Journal, which is known as Mirage. So Kate, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very, very pleased to be part of this panel and in the context of this wonderful retrospective of Rose's work. I'd like to outline the artistic and political arena that was in place when I first met Rose and was introduced to her work in the late 1970s. And it all began for me when I was studying fine art at the Slade, and a dawning political consciousness led me to the arguments of feminism. I redrew the map of my own upbringing and burgeoning career as one that was circumscribed by the prejudices of a patriarchal culture and the limitations Western society put on the lives of women. I immersed myself in the writings of Simone de Beauvoir, Germaine Greer, Lucy Lippard, and Juliet Mitchell. Now, one day, an ad in Spare Rib caught my eye. The Women Artists Collective was opening its doors to new members. All were welcome. The collective revealed itself to be a group of 4 women: Hannah O'Shea, Rose Finn-Kelcey, Tina Keane, and Sonia Knox, who's sitting over there. And they were all involved in performance art to a greater or lesser degree. The group was presided over by the art historian Jessica York. The photographer Annie Wright was the only other new recruit who turned up on the day. And perhaps by virtue of being not being among the originals, Annie and I became friends and collaborators, taking our example from Rose and Tina, who before and during the time of the collective made a series of works together. Annie and I became part of a network of what Sarah Turner has described as a counterculture of making. Now, this photograph was taken at my wedding, and on the left there's Sonia Knox, and then it's Jessica York, there's myself, and Rose is on the right. The Women Artists Collective met in a damp and dingy room in Earlham Street, and the conversation turned on many of the key issues of second-wave feminism. However, the problem that most exercised the collective was how to forge a viable cultural visibility as a woman in an art world largely dominated by men. This was not simply a question of infiltrating the gallery system and insisting on a greater representation for women, but a necessary grappling with the established languages of fine art practice. How could we make meaning when the tools of the trade were so heavily predetermined by inscriptions etched by centuries of man-made culture? As Rose herself put it, our task was, and I quote, to find an appropriate voice for our experiences as women artists. This is Rose's Mind the Gap from 1980. Before she adopted a strategy of vacated performances, which is something I'll come back to, Rose frequently worked live, creating events in which her body carried a measure of the substance and meaning of the work. For her and other women working live, the problem of female representation was acute. Rose had to run the gauntlet of a culture that had established the terms of women's visibility, either obscured by domesticity or positioned publicly as spectacle, as an eroticized object of male desire. Women then as now were subject to the societal pressure, self-policed by the internalized viewer, to be permanently on show, whether at home or in the public realm, a situation considerably aggravated today by the cult of the self promulgated by social media. Catherine Long has argued that the exhibition of women's bodies, classified according to rigid codes of sexual desirability, serves, in fact, to render women culturally invisible. For some artists working in the 1970s, such as Mary Kelly, the solution was to quit the realm of the visible world, refusing any direct representations of the female body in what Peggy Phelan later dubbed active vanishing. Kelly regarded the image of woman as irredeemably overdetermined in both popular iconography and art history, erotically marked and aligned with narcissism, with nature rather than culture. Theorists and art historians such as Griselda Pollock and Lisa Tickner discussed instead conceptual approaches that removed the female body from view, although its traces sometimes remained, instead foregrounding the intellect and the artist's engagement with cultural theory. For Rose and other women working in performance, such as Rose English, Anne Bean, and Rose Garrard, the option of relegating the body of the artist to obscurity was unworkable and indeed unthinkable, as Sally Potter said. Rose had to find new ways of being seen. She had to develop feminist strategies of public appearance and behavior that Deirdre Hedden defined as a desire to, and I quote, reconfigure the visible and unsettle the seemingly given. Rose did not enact a total rejection of pre-existing fine art traditions, nor did she replace them with a feminist canon with its own set of rules and strictures. Instead, she embraced the foundational principles of performance, the loosening of boundaries separating fine art, theatre, burlesque, music, and dance. And like the magpie that featured in a number of her early works, Rose brazenly stole from other disciplines, learning the principles of engineering, ornithology, linguistics, etc., according to the demands of individual works. She developed through performance a mutable and fugitive identity, embodying a kind of mediumship of flux and change. There was no Rose Finn-Kelcey house style. She favoured no one medium over another, and no two works were ever alike. As Maria Walsh has written, Rose, by virtue of her chameleon-like persona, created, and I quote, artistic gestures that intervened in but did not stabilize meaning. This strategic elusiveness did not protect Rose from criticism within the feminist community in the late 70s and 80s, whereby Marxist feminists cast doubt on the political efficacy of performance art for women, on the grounds that appearing live before a mixed audience was uncomfortably close to the spectacle of striptease. The critique was particular to the feminist context in the UK, whereas in the Americas, artists such as Carolee Schneemann, Anna Mendieta, Hannah Wilkie both mourned the physical abuses of the female body and celebrated women's eroticism with uninhibited displays of ritualized nakedness. Schneemann, when working in London, was aware of the debates within the feminist art community, and in her Naked Action lecture at the ICA, she set out to discover whether she could maintain her authority as an active subject speaking about her practice whilst repeatedly undressing and dressing. Rose, however, did not take her clothes off in public. In fact, she once dissuaded me from doing a striptease on the grounds that however badly executed my act, any attempt at satire would be co-opted and reduced to a sexualized spectacle. I did do it, actually, but as a book. Helen DeWitt has said of Tina Keen's work, and I think it also applies to Rose's, that she sought to, and I quote, transform the self by transforming place. Rose created environments in which her physical presence was framed by elements that disrupted conventional readings of femininity and opened up new ones, the body of the artist taking its place within a choreography of signs. Guy Brett has written that Rose later deflected those calcified readings of woman by shifting her presence into surrogates and proxies, the magpie in One for Sorrow, Two for Joy, the miniature homunculus in Book and Pillow. However, I would argue that it was the live, breathing, whispering, gesturing, running and shrieking Rose that for me constituted the most unequivocal assertion of a subject position that could no longer be reduced to the negative term in the binary of masculine and feminine that dominated visual culture in the mid-20th century. And here I can cite Sally Potter, who believed that performance was a radical form of expression for women. In her catalogue essay for About Time, which I curated with Rose Garrard, and it included Rose Finn-Kelcey's Mind the Gap, Potter argued that the physical presence of the woman artist makes it harder to consume the image. There is always a double presence, the woman whose skill as performer and artist is made manifest through her actions, and the mask she wears, the identity she adopts. I believe that this goes some way to explaining why Rose was so careful about the images that she released of her performances. The gulf between the subversive live event and its residues marks the enclosure of subjectivity, the relegation of the cathartic and the impure into the economy of the symbolic order. I'd like to end with some recollections of Rose. It's often been remarked that she was extremely rigorous in her research, and her works were executed with consummate skill and precision. When I knew her, she was reading everything she could about witchcraft. And when the debates about nudity I mentioned were raging in feminist circles in the 1970s, Rose decided to go out and see for herself, and she spent several days with a friend trawling the strip clubs of Soho. The perfection of her craft was hard won. In her 1995 questionnaire to artists, she asked, "When you don't have a clue what you want to do with your work, what do you do?" And in her own answer, she confesses that as well as overeating and leafing through National Geographic, she also indulged in long telephone conversations. And I remember those telephone discussions in which Rose would reflect on the progress of the current piece of work. Hers was a tortuous creative process, which I believe caused her genuine distress. She was plagued by doubts, torn between conflicting views of a problem and its infinite possible solutions. She was tormented by a nameless inner turmoil that threatened to derail the entire process, and I do have some ideas about what that might have been. She always seemed to reach a point when the project was declared a disaster, beyond salvage. And then, from the ashes of this disaster, the most beautifully judged, perfectly achieved work would emerge. Then the whole process would start again with the next piece of work. Now, remembering these long conversations, I was reminded of a quote from Anne-Marie Sozo-Boetti's famous essay, Negative Capability as Practice in Women's Art, a text that Rose knew well. Sozo-Boetti defined the creative project for a woman artist as one that, and I quote, involves betraying the expressive mechanisms of culture in order to express herself through the break within the gaps between systematic spaces of artistic language. For Boetti, this was not, and I quote again, a matter of accusation or vindication, but of transgression, closer to madness than to reason. Now, the audio element of Mind the Gap provides further evidence of Rose's work in progress. Her voice describes ideas that had been discarded, others that she had implemented. Rejects included, she wanted to dance on a pile of black grapes, treading the juice through a sieve. And she wondered if there were any recordings of the sound made by woodworm while damaging property. And finally, the one that she executed. She wanted to try an experiment where you place a block of ice between two supports, lay a wire over the middle of the ice, and tie a brick to the free ends. Pressure should make the ice melt as the wire glides through, leaving the ice to reseal itself. This was Rose the alchemist, the poet, the humorist, and the optimist. Whatever dark journeys she made to create her work, the ice always resealed itself. The chaos resolved into art, generating new forms and new conjunctions of ideas. Works that were enigmatic but refined, precise and precisely unsettling of the seemingly given in art.
Thank you so much, Kate. We're now going to hear from Jo Stockham. So Jo's been professor and head of printmaking programme since 2008 at the Royal College of Art, and her background in teaching is in teaching sculpture and architecture, and of running gallery-based workshops and talks, and that contributes to the passion that she has for the interrelatedness of making work and creating spaces for discussion. So Jo has undertaken many residencies, and these have included the Henry Moore Fellowship at Kettle's Yard, an Artist in Residence at Warwick University, and a Yaddo Fellowship in New York. Commissions have included permanent installation for Liverpool's Institute of Performing Arts, and that was in collaboration with Daryl Viner, and work for a joint project, Triplicate, for Tate St Ives, Southampton City Art Gallery and Eastbourne Gallery. And her work's been the focus of solo exhibitions, such as No News at the Arnolfini in Bristol, Changing Places at Camden Arts Centre in London, and also that was at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge. Jo has exhibited internationally, often making work that explores the history of a site. And her current writing, publications and prints focus on the implication of virtual technologies. She's interested in a speculative attitude to making as a form of thinking, informs both her work and her teaching. So Jo, over to you.
Thank you. The image on the screen at the moment is a lamp that belonged to Rose. And I think it introduces some of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of a kind of sense of wonder and a curiosity about how to encapsulate things that move, things that are intangible, and things that cannot be named, which in a way Kate was speaking about so beautifully as well in terms of definitions of things. I think I first met Rose when she was building her first steam piece at Chisenhall Gallery, where I have my studio. And she also had a studio there for some time. But I think my first encounter with her work was the Bureau de Change at Matt's Gallery in 1987. And that was probably the case for many people because it received so much kind of publicity. And what I found so wonderful about it was the idea, it took a sort of logic and took it to an extreme, the idea that art had become money. And what would happen if you just followed that thought through. And there's a kind of literalism to that, which I think is there in a lot of Rose's work, which is very kind of brave, because it could all go horribly wrong in a certain way. But the kind of meticulousness, the kind of attention to detail that Kate also talked about, I think, and the kind of real crafting of what this scenario, this assemblage of material, how it would be received down to the detail of a kind of a guard looking after the piece of work, the lighting, all the kind of orchestration of it, the theatre of it, was something that I think Rose excelled in. Later on, I also taught with Rose on the MA Sculpture course, and I know that Mia will talk more about that aspect of her work, and I'll mention it again later. But I think that this lamp also talks about the way that Rose delighted in bridging worlds, the kind of phenomenal and the kind of visual. Her work refuses so many boundaries, male, female, urban, rural, material, immaterial, and thrives on a kind of ambiguity and androgyny, which I identify as a kind of transgression, which Catherine also talked of. An interest in engineering and machines and in the politics of power in a real politics sense remains, I would argue, a kind of taboo for women in many ways. In fact, I went to work today with a colleague who's one of whose daughters is studying engineering and is one of only 2 women in a class of about 50 men in the engineering department in university. So there are these kind of aspects of who has the right to think about what, which I think are actually arguably being re-entrenched in our political time, but maybe that's something we'll kind of come to. And to one extent, one extremely insignificant aspect of Rose's work is that it's part of the legacy of kinetic work, which I would say is, so how to make a cloud, how to still the flow of a skirt in the wind. These are technical challenges which Rose really relished. Guy Brett, who championed Rose's work, is a key historian of this still very undervalued area of work. And in writing about Rose's wind-powered flags, such as gale warning, this next slide, he says, taking one's work out into the wind can be paralleled by bringing weather indoors, which is what the lamp is in a way. Surrender to whatever climate brings can be counterpointed by creating a climate artificially. This is what Finn-Kelcey set out to do with the steam installation, which was made to animate the huge chilly, concrete-floored and windowless space of Chisenhale Gallery in the East End of London, which was partly inspired by her visits to the nearby steam baths in Bethnal Green. And this sense, which I think has recurred through all our discussions about sort of everyday experience, kind of suddenly, or an encounter with something, a chance encounter with something, suddenly becoming the kind of key to a piece of work or a project, is something very characteristic of Rose. And I remember very much that that was a project that was always on the point of collapse and disaster and was never going to be made because it's a kind of conceptually crazy thing to want to do. The work was arguably never going to do what she wanted it to do, a cube of steam. And after many changes and experiments and the very real possibility that it wasn't going to work at all at the opening, the final work was thrown every time anyone entered the room to see it, because of the dynamics of the doors between the space, which were at a diagonal, throwing these tumultuous shadows, animating the room as if it was boiling, which I really enjoyed and Rose was really annoyed by. And no photos show this aspect, partly because it really irritated Rose, perhaps because to stare at the walls was to be distracted from the structure and the stillness and the reference to minimalism and the kind of control that she wished to be exhibited in the work. So that kind of sense of control and a kind of perfectionism, and its opposite, a kind of willful kind of breaking of boundaries and desire to play and disrupt, is something that I think is very characteristic both of Rose as a person and of the work itself. To return to the idea of gender and androgyny, the image of Rose as a matador is very interesting to me, and I think speaks very much what Kate's sort of descriptions of how to include the body as a woman artist, how to be present. If there was a fight to be had, it was to be won by strength and beauty and perhaps disguise. Guy Brett, writing again about the restless image, the handstand photograph next door, wrote about this discrepancy between the seen position and the felt position, which I would suggest is a position for all women and was obviously at the centre of certain feminist debates and continues to be so. I think it now, in a way, increasingly includes men in a world where performing to social media and visual appearance is key. Pleasure seems to me a very striking aspect of Rose's work. Pleasure in found images, in dressing up, in materials, in processes, in releasing things from their everyday use into another space, a speculative space. As when Rose speaks in the video next door of taking the Chinese characters she noticed in shops in China and stringing them out like cables on a cable car in her show in Milton Keynes. Value in all senses of the world. The value of materials. Who is the audience? What is the purpose of the work? What questions does it ask of us? As an artist, what might the drive to make work be? Isn't work more about asking questions than answering them? Each project seemed to be driven by a problem and an attraction, a question technical and philosophical, and usually unanswering, a kind of engineering and an ambition of scale. I would say that the boundaries between the everyday and art is probably a generational interest, and one that I feel I have a legacy that I've inherited, which is very much being returned to today amongst students and in very many forms, obviously aided and complicated by our immersion in these kinds of machines. The final work I want to address is Angel, which Rose made in 2004. One of my research interests is in diagrams and language, and something that I spoke to Rose a lot about, especially as we both went to China and we were talking about learning Mandarin, not learning it very well, and things like that. But and I wrote about Angel for a spec for a book on diagrams and art. Emoticons could, of course, be said to be a kind of diagram. And this particular work, I think, is a very beautiful constellation of Rose's interests in language, image and material and weather. So I'll just read you what I wrote for the book. An example of the re-entry of the diagrammatic into the material world is Rose Finn-Kelcey's Angel, 2004. Situated on the facade of St Paul's Church in Bow, it vivified an otherwise rather unloved stretch of Burdett Road in East London. My memory of first encountering this work is one of total confusion, delight and demand in one. What initially appeared to be a 5 metre by 15 metre animation or back projection, as light rippled across the surface of an image, creating an ever-changing image, revealed itself to be made of thousands of plastic shimmer discs of the kind used on theatre hoardings, spelling out, as it spells out, angel, the text for angel. These gaudy, cheap, giant sequins mapped out the symbols with drop shadows and a rich orange and silver surround. An initial recognition of the wit of this code quickly gave way to a real sense of wonder. Since the image was animated by the weather alone, the relationship to a greater power, rather than a commercial graphic, took over. Since the image's horizontal reading required a tilting of the viewer's head, it is possible that many people walking past the church itself were first aware of the spectacle, seeing the crowds of young people at the bus stop opposite with their heads on one side, trying to reincorporating the angel back into their mobile phones. As a tutor in the painting school at the Royal College of Art, Rose was hugely influential. And I've had students who spoke to me of the difference between encountering Rose, her appearance and her often flamboyant dress sense, and the assumptions they made about her being scotched on first conversation. She used to take a group of students to Brussels every year to eat mussels and introduce them to Marcel Proust's. Although she taught in painting, she was a huge enabler of people who felt they didn't quite fit into the definitions of painting, or I think actually into the definitions of being, and people who were finding a language which bridged different interests. For me, that is her legacy, that all attempts to contain an idea or categorize a person will fail, but in that failure is a kind of freedom.
Thank you, Joe. So we're now going to hear from Peter Liversidge. He's a male artist. He's a female artist. You should get introduced that way. He's a male artist. And all his works start with a conceptually based practice of creating proposals for performances across a wide expanse of mediums. And so Peter types these proposals on an old manual typewriter, and the proposals describe the idea, and they go from the practical to the purely hypothetical. So they range from, I propose to paint the wall that the proposals are hung on, dark grey, to I propose to dam the Thames and flood the City of London. So Peter's work has been exhibited in a diverse range of institutions across the globe, including Tate Gallery in London, the Centre d'Art in Santa Monica, Barcelona, the Bloomberg Space in London, the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, the Whitechapel Gallery in London, Tate Liverpool in 2008, Edinburgh Sculpture Park, Jupiter Artland in 2009, and the Edinburgh Art Festival in 2013, and 2016 to 70s at the Aldrich in Connecticut. And in 2016, the Tate commissioned Peter to write a unique cycle of songs in response to Tate Modern's new building, its histories, and its place in contemporary life. And a choir of 500 people performed it on the bridge, the choral piece for Tate Modern, in the Tate's Turbine Hall. And that was the centrepiece of the opening weekend's events. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it really feels a huge honour to be here. And I was trying to think, obviously like everyone else, how on earth do you talk about Rose? And so I thought I'd start by talking about Rose when I met her. So I met her in end of 2000, and I'd left college, university in 96, and it was my first commission for something that didn't belong to an exhibition, which was a multiple for the Multiple store. And I remember going into the offices, which at that point were in Tottenham Court Road, and Nikki and Sally, who run the multiple store, said, "Oh, you're one of 3 multiples being launched in December." I said, "Oh, who are the others?" And said, "Oh, Rose Finn-Kelcey's one." I thought, "What, Rose Finn-Kelcey?" It was like this huge thrill. And I really wanted to talk about that thing that Rose had, whether it was with how she dressed, how she spoke to people. Her enthusiasm for work was incredible. I mean, she could be talking about, and the reason this brand is here, by the way, is because Rose only ate. She only drank, the only drink she would drink was brandy, and she had a little hip flask. And so you'd go out there and you say, "Oh, do you want a beer, Rose?" And she'd look at you as if to say, "You've forgotten, haven't you? I only have brandy." So she'd have this hip flask with brandy in. But going back to making this multiple works, I remember seeing in the multiple stores office, she'd been practicing how to sign her signature on House Rules, which is the red LED piece you'll see in the exhibition upstairs. But the great thing was, anything made out of black plastic in the office was signed with Rose Finn-Kelcey 2001. So they had everything from pencil sharpeners to sellotape dispensers, and everything had Rose's name all over it. And I remember meeting her for the first time, and she just had this incredible generosity which stretched through the entire relationship we had with her until her death. And I think what's fascinating about Rose was, as Joe alluded to at the end there, was that sense of support. Because how I make work is not, I fought for my entire, and still do, not to have a signature style, not to make work that looks like my work. And that is, it's such an important thing, because within a market, if you will, you're told, well, I'm not meant to say who it was, a good friend of mine, a painter friend, was making work, and then he made new work, and collectors didn't want to buy it because it didn't look like his work. And that to me was like an abhorrent sense of what it meant to be creative. And what Rose allowed me to do, and she was the first person in my entire life. Both of my parents were in the NHS, or were, they're retired now, and she just made it available. She made it mean something. She made what you did, or she gave you support in a way that she just by being there, I can't quite describe, there's this essence to Rose that was much more than her fabulous glasses and her amazing red hair and incredible colours. I feel like I'm completely dressed down for this. I should be in like a neon tutu or something. Had it been the weekend. But there was that sense, and what was wonderful for us is that we lived opposite one another across a park, and I used to cycle. I had various really poor jobs for a long time, just simply because I wanted work that I didn't have to think in. And I would cycle past Rose maybe 4 or 5 times a week, and on my way to work in a framing factory. And I'd cycle past her, I'd say, "Morning, Rose," and she'd say, "Morning." And this went on for about 4 years. And she was on her way to the very steam bath you were talking about in York Hall for her swim. And what was remarkable about Rose was she used to swim underwater the whole length. I mean, I can barely swim a length, but she could do it underwater. And that was just one of these remarkable things about her. And we were talking just at the beginning, Kate and I were just having a chat because we'd not properly met. And what was interesting is my wife and I have got 2 young boys, and Rose became an honorary grandparent, and we'd see her a lot. She used to babysit, or as she liked to call it, big boy sit, for my 2 sons. And what was incredible was she had this real gift, especially with my youngest son, who just all the time still asks for her. And there was a real sense of her just being there. She had a real, even she didn't have to say anything. Sometimes she'd come to birthday parties with the boys, and as it is, they'd be having fizzy pop and she'd be there with the brandy. But really, in a really beautiful way, she'd join in with all the games and she'd help. When she launched the book, actually, my wife, who's a fabulous baker, they made miniature books for everyone to eat at the book launch. And sorry, I've lost my way slightly. I sort of tripped myself up very publicly there, didn't I?
It was actually the cover, wasn't it?
It was the cover. So we made, I say we, that's the royal we, because I absolutely had nothing to do with it whatsoever. But what was incredible about that was it was the same meticulous detail that both Kate and Joe have spoken about. That with Cassie, my wife, they researched the right rice paper, the right consistency of rice paper. How do you get black rice paper? Now, how do you get the right colour? If you imagine this book about a fifth of its size, but as a sponge cake, and with this cover, it was delicious, wasn't it? You see,
I ate one.
oh, you did? I know. I wish I'd kept it. I really did. And these things just, it was that same level of detail that you'd see in the incredible flag works or the performances. It wasn't, you know, she wasn't just an artist, she was a person. And it's so important to remember, because you get to a point and you can become a myth. And actually the myth isn't, it's a fraction of who they actually were. You know, I remember going through, we used to see her on Christmas Day, and one thing my sons, both of them, wanted to say was she had a Christmas tree that you couldn't work out how you got that Christmas tree into the room, because it was huge. It was massive. It was literally, if it came in here, you could imagine the top sort of just touching the roof. And she had this sense of generosity that stretched. And I know, because friends of mine who've worked with her, it's not unique to me, and I'm really pleased about that. And I feel that we're lucky in a lot of ways because we knew her. But actually, we can all get to know her just by looking at her work and feeling that, you know, she had this amazing generosity and this idea. And a lot of the time, I mean, sometimes colleges are foolish enough to invite me in to do tutorials. And I always talk to them about Rose, because she had that sense, and going back to what I started with, this idea of being outside of your work, that she didn't want to be an expert. You know, she was an expert in every project, but she didn't want to have this overriding Rose Finn-Kelcey style. If anything, she did, but she didn't. It was, you know, belonged, it almost as if her work belonged to everything before it was made, if that makes sense. You know, that she was able to just be very free, but then also with that meticulous sense of detail and that approach to just being inclusive. I mean, I know that when we were talking that there were very different historical periods within and how we met, or how you met her and how I met her, very different times, but I still feel that within her, I mean, the engineering part is quite interesting because she grew up on a farm, which is fascinating because she had this other side to her that you think she must have grown up in a point, what was she, 6, 7, so, you know, post-mechanisation, farming mechanisation, where actually you do see these machines come in and take away jobs, change the landscape. And in some ways I think I'm constantly shocked when I talk to students and they say, oh, you should look at Rose Finn-Kelcey's work, and they go away and you might see them 2 or 3 weeks later and they say, why did I not know about Rose Finn-Kelcey's work? And I know that's immensely, it's a ridiculous thing to hear myself saying, but it's so true. But thankfully it shows like this. That
We've had this in the exhibition responses, actually, when you go around with friends or other visitors sometimes, people will say, how did I not know about Rose before? And because her body of work is so substantial and she's working on large, invested, fascinating projects, we're only showing a fraction of things in the galleries. And that really does kind of come up that people are very surprised. And the only way to explain it, as we were chatting about before, is I just say, well, art people were very familiar with her work, but because the work was based often to be an experience or a temporary moment where it existed, you could, I'm sure, get through life without knowing about it until you do.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I think I could probably go on a little bit too long, so. Yeah. But thank you anyway.
Would you like to say one sentence on the images?
Oh, yes,
and I'll
yes,
just
sorry, I
scroll
forgot
through
about
these.
So the Hello flag, in fact, I was just thinking there are several works that are influenced by Rose, but the Hello flag came out of talking about the Here's a Gale warning flag and that idea of what a flag was, and we were just talking about that. This was in 2011-12, and we were just talking about the idea, and it came up that a flag is just a greeting. That's all it is. Before you do anything, it tells an approaching person who you are, where you are, etc. So the Hello flag came out of that. And then the bunting too, we're often talking about this sense of existing within a space or being yourself as either a performer, but also having an area in which things are permitted to happen. And that's where the bunting piece came from in all its different variants.
That's nice.
But no, it's fine.
That's really nice.
Thank you, anyway, yeah.
So now we're going to move on to Hermione Wiltshire. So a little about her. So Hermione Wiltshire, she is an artist and a senior tutor on the photography programme at the School of Arts and Humanities at the Royal College of Art. Hermione studied sculpture at Central St Martin's Art Design in London, followed by an MA at Chelsea School of Art. And in 1993, Hermione was the MoMArt Fellow at the Tate Gallery in Liverpool, where she spent 6 months carrying out a residency which was culminated in an exhibition which was titled Elective Affinities. She's also a scholar at the British School in Rome, and she's the recipient of many awards, which include the GLA, the Arts Council and the Arts Foundation as awarding bodies. She is also in many national and international collections, including the Arts Council, the Walker Arts Collection in Liverpool, and the Weltskunst Collection. And Hermione's practice itself is both photographic and sculptural. Her research is in gender politics, radical feminist theory, public space, and the status and politics of the photographic image. And her current research is the maternal and birth in contemporary art. Hermione.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to speak in a slightly different way, because in a way I'm going to speak about our friendship and how that is merged completely with the making of art and the documenting of it. So I think it echoes what others have said. The Steam piece and the Royal Books were exhibited in 1993 at the Saatchi Gallery at St John's Wood in London as part of the Young British Artists. And Rose was delighted to show the Steam piece again after showing it at Chisenhale, and it was an opportunity to show the Royal Box as a companion piece. It was very complicated, as Jo already described, and she was extremely excited. But when asked for her biographical details for the catalogue, she flatly refused to give her age. And our mutual friend Mary Rose Finn and I had thrown a 50th birthday party for her, so we knew perfectly well that the staff at Saatchi tried to persuade her to relinquish this detail, and she never gave in. So consequently, we haven't got the page from the Saatchi book, but we have the page from, which I think is the next slide, which gives all sorts of dates, incredibly going back a very long way, but they don't say when she's born. And I want to use this to demonstrate something about her ambivalence towards the art world, and it contributes to making it complicated to map out her influence. And I think that's something that you describe so beautifully, Kate. And I think there's still more to say about that, particularly Ed Ruscha. She may not have been officially qualified as a young British artist, as she's already been showing in Britain for 20 years at that point, but the work was framed as young, and that seemed to me very significant. So after her show at Camden Arts Centre in 1997, she exhibited The Pearly Gate in Limerick, at the Limerick Art Gallery as part of the EVA Festival in Ireland. And she invited me to go with her just for fun. It was a sort of absolutely typical, that other people say, typical thing for her to say, just come with me and for company, and you'll enjoy yourself. She was very, very taken not only by exhibiting in Ireland, but also that Paul O'Reilly, who ran the gallery, was so devout a Catholic that he went to Mass every day. So for her, Catholicism had permeated even the art world, with a gigantic pearly sculpture about heaven. So this is the Pearly Gate. This is an oversized farm gate, and she spent a disproportionate amount of time getting the pearly quality right, and the exact kind of paint had to be brought up to a certain temperature and baked, and it was incredibly arduous getting this quality. But she was just so absolutely delighted that this should be shown in this this place immersed in Catholicism, and it was absolutely right for her. A similar thing happened in Rome when we were both scholars at the same time at the British School in Rome. And the all-pervasive Catholicism in Rome was so delicately deployed when she announced she was canvassing trainee priests, seminaries, for their drawings of God and where they might live. And of course, this is the drawings that are shown upstairs. This way of expanding meanings and framings and definitions extended to our friendship in such a way that when she asked me to help her document God's book and house rules and it rules, there was no question I wouldn't agree, as it was a chance to spend time in her company, which was always such a pleasure, and work together as well. And we spent ages shooting and reshooting these pieces at the Royal College of Art, where we both taught, retaking again and again to get the images the best they could possibly be. Probably the most ephemeral of these was the photographic record in her makeshift studio during the summer of 2009. I'm not sure if John managed to scan that. That's one of the drawings that are upstairs. And another one. Go on one more. This was one of the pieces that I helped her document. It Pays to Pray. There's one of the ones that we did together. And this. Yeah. So she had this particular summer 2009, she didn't have a studio and it bothered her terribly, and she then said that she'd found this wedge of concrete on the side of the Thames, and that it had become her studio. And of course, it was only the right scale when the tide was at exactly the right point, because obviously it disappeared and then it became too long. So we discussed this for ages about when would the tide be at exactly the right height in order to get the wedge visible enough. It took a long, long time, and I'm pretty sure that we shot it at least twice, if not more. Photographing her from the other side of the Thames, other side of the river in the sunlight on that day felt very, very similar to pushing her around Victoria Park for a breath of fresh air during the long periods in hospital during the last months of her life. She said to me she would like next time for me to bring her a video camera, so that because she wanted to film people looking at her in the wheelchair, because she could see how particularly children who were at the same level as her when she was in the wheelchair looked at her, and she really wanted to have this footage. And here we were, again, very shortly before she died, talking and planning works of art. And really what I wanted to say is that never stopped, and there wasn't really a division between friendship, between making work and planning the next piece. And that's where I'd like to stop.
Thank you, Hermione. So our final presentation is by Mia Taylor. So Mia, as an artist, has a broad interdisciplinary practice that includes writing, video, sound, painting, sculpture and performance. Her recent work addresses concepts of distance and the mapping of narrative and information over time and space, with a focus on the natural environment. She's interested in forms of storytelling as means to speculate, obfuscate, I can't say that, and communicate histories that are subjectively as well as objectively charged, and the potential for disorientation within seemingly fixed language systems. So her current projects consider the wilderness in relationship to ecological change and human and non-human activity within it, and draw upon recent experiences with signal fire art in Oregon and the UK OSNAP research cruise to the subpolar North Atlantic. Her work's been shown at venues including Jerwood Visual Arts, Whitechapel Gallery, Letherby Gallery, Pulse in New York City, Special Projects, and NADA Miami. And she's a member of 5 Years, which is an unfunded artist gallery in London, where programming maintains a direct relationship to practice, and also me as a senior teaching fellow at Winchester School of Art.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about when... so I met Rose in 2005. She was teaching at Chelsea College of Art at the time, and I was a student there. Rose wasn't my tutor at first, but I'd seen her around and seen her as this very kind of composed, slightly serious-seeming woman who was wearing very bright clothing. Later, we could ask for our tutors, and I had Rose. And at our first tutorial, I presented her with 2 ideas or directions that the work could go in, thinking that she would help identify which one was the strongest thing. But instead, she asked me lots of questions, and then kind of left me with the decision of choosing how I wanted to move forward. And at the time, I think I wanted some clearer guidance, but in retrospect, what she gave was much better. What she'd done was facilitated inquiry and given space to make a decision without her judgment or kind of her influence. She wasn't the kind of tutor to push her position or agenda. She wasn't prescriptive. She was encouraging, but very rigorous. And her support and interest continued past the tutorial slot. I remember lots of times when she would come up to me much later in the day and with a question or a comment about something we had talked about much earlier. So, which was always amazing because it made you feel like she was still thinking about what you were doing, which was wonderful. I asked some of Rose's other ex-students for some of their reflections, which I'm going to read out. I had some very warm responses, and it was really interesting how many of the same things cropped up. So Simon Rattigan, who also graduated in 2005, said, "I remember the last tutorial just before the final MA show, when Rose really annoyed me by pointing out all the bits in my work where I'd let my attention to detail slip. I felt she was being petty at that late stage, but really I was just irritated because she was spot on with what she said and I had to do the work all again." He says, "I still often stop myself when nearing the end of some work and ask what she would say and look at it again, see if I got all the details right and what I have missed and if it goes far enough. From the start, she was always active on multiple levels, questioning everything from the intellectual groundings of your practice down to the practical details of materials and production. And it never felt like she was doing anything other than looking out for you and that she was always on your side." Matthew Carver, an international student from Canada, talked about her modesty. He said, "There were 2 extreme poles regarding the professors and tutors I interacted with during my undergraduate in Canada and graduate programme at Chelsea in London. There were ones who, however subtly or not, would let slip to you about their upcoming show, recent breakthrough in the studio, or the important art world figures they had met, or the prestigious art award they'd been nominated for. Or there was a rare person like Rose, who was there for you." He says, "She visited me a year after my master's in my East London studio, and it was only then that she casually opened up about her own upcoming solo work, and that she'd had this upcoming show at Milton Keynes. He had no idea that she did such fantastic work, had a career, was in the Tate collection, and he says, as we all know, she should have been even more well known and respected. And that says so much that he would only learn about how great and accomplished an artist Rose was after she had left. She wasn't the one who was pushing that." Yes, this is a photo of her at Chelsea at the time with some students and tutors. What's the next photo? Yeah. So some of these are kind of personal photos. These photos are Liz Murray's, who I'm also going to talk about. And the next photo, private view. So she came to all of our private views. She stayed in touch with loads of us. I mean, not just at Chelsea, at the Royal College, lots of ex-students. Would come to all of our private views and was, kind of Peter mentioned, this support that was just there. And I think that's absolutely true. There was this sense of support. Liz Murray, whose photos these are, and who Rose commissioned on behalf of Islington Council when Rose was doing a project with Islington Council to do a performance. And if you click on, oh yeah, Rose's brilliant, wonderful clothing, just an example. So yeah, Rose commissioned Liz to do a performance at Highbury in Islington, and she did this, They Came From Nowhere. And if you click on again, which Rose, basically came and regulated the whole performance in a high-vis vest. this is her there. She was always there. Liz says of Rose, my abiding memory of Rose, apart from her outrageously bright clothing, especially silver bomber jackets and gold lame skirts, is of her generosity and friendship to ex-students. She'd always come to any opening I had, plus was a good person to go out with when times were bad or confusing. I remember many a night putting the world to rights in the Palm Tree, the pub near Rose. I think many of us remember nights like that, with copious supplies of brandy and laughter. And let's not forget her temper, especially when it came to perceived misogyny or chauvinism. Rose was very generous in many, many ways, and also in passing opportunities on to students or extending her world to us. She gave me one of my first teaching opportunities in the painting department at the RCA, and Rose, and also this project, for example, and that was something that Rose would do easily, it felt actually, and was wonderful. Rose stayed in touch with a number of us after graduating. She, I don't know if you remember this, Jo, but she learned Mandarin, I think, with an ex-student, Han Feng, who was an international student from China before she went on the residency, the Red Mansion residency. And she would come to our openings, do studio visits, we'd go and see shows together, and she would always invite us to her shows and open up her world to us. As well as her many amazing projects that are kind of here, and the exhibition, and that are kind of being talked about, there were a number of projects certainly in the last few years, that weren't realised for different reasons. Many practical because they were very ambitious, had health and safety implications that could not be resolved. And so they didn't happen, which was frustrating for Rose. But what I remember about that time was her persevering and always looking for solutions within that. One unrealised project, which Guy Brett described as, in the book, a public commission currently in progress, which involves 3 9-foot deep circular holes in the pavement, lit internally and covered by glass. In one, a male and a female figure fall backwards into paradise. So this was a huge project, lots of meetings with people that would be organising it, and a huge amount of research. And one of the things that I remember about it was and how she was going to be deciding how the figures would fall into the hole, and she would have all these maquettes, but she also built, I think it was scale, although I'm trying to get my head around that, a scale model in her studio in Limehouse. So this
to scale.
Huge hole in her studio in Limehouse, for which she built another kind of platform to look down, and invited these performers and dancers, I think, to pose and kind of enact this falling into the hole, which she would then take photos of. And this was to try and understand how these kind of made figures would be. And I think for me, just that level of rigour and play and testing and exploring all the possibilities was exemplary. And also on that kind of rigorous note, just to go back to the book and the cake. She'd been working on her book for years, getting the details right, and then she kind of finally finished it and had the launch coming up. And she was thinking about the launch and thinking about having drinks. And then she was thinking that maybe people would want something to eat. And instead of just thinking, oh, we'll put some nuts out, the something to eat became this artwork. It became these amazing all these amazing cakes that were mini palm-sized replicas of the monograph, with the book covers literally printed on the top of each that you could take away or eat. And yeah, it was an artwork in its own right, which I think of a little bit, maybe a bit spuriously in relation to the Bureau de Change. This kind of artwork that's dispersed into the world or in people's bodies on this kind of different kind of circulation. Yes, good. And Another thing I was just going to talk about is the collages, the preparatory sketches which are upstairs. And it's likely that these are one of the last things that Rose made. And it's hard to speculate what they were for, whether they were beginnings of new work or a playful generation of ideas and imagery without an end goal, or something else. But it makes me think of the different processes and experiments that Rose would employ to generate and develop ideas, to invoke the unconscious at times through automatic writing or even the I Ching. And it's interesting to see in some of these collages, particularly the ones that have been selected, that some of the themes in many of her other works appear, such as Guy Brett put it, the diminishing downward spiral in God's Bog, in the snail shell upstairs, and in this one, the boy standing over the hole or the cavity or the gap in the ground, another downward viewpoint or a beyond. If I think about Rose's influence, I think about her as a whole in all aspects of her life, how she was part of many communities, from art to teaching to her local community. When I would go out with her, she always would know the people in all the shops, all their names. She knew the people around her, and the people that she swam with or knew through swimming every day at York Hall, and the school that she was working with Cassie and Peter's children. Yeah. And her art openings and parties with her flask of brandy, her almost architectural Christmas tree towering the height of 2 floors in her house, and the many plants and flowers she cultivated. She introduced me to artists such as Rita Donna and Valley Export, and that when I talked about nervousness at teaching, she said she still sometimes experienced imposter syndrome herself. She was alert to the world. She felt alert to the world to me. She said what she thought, even if it ruffled feathers. She didn't stylize or pin herself down to a process, medium or set of ideas, and that she chose not to be represented by a gallery seemed key, and that she was prepared to think and had a huge capacity to talk and think deeply about art. Not long after Rose had been diagnosed with her illness, I also went with her to Victoria Park, she in her wheelchair and me walking, and it was obviously a very hard time for Rose. But amongst many things she talked about how she'd been thinking about making new work in this new situation, and how the wheelchair had opened up newer perspectives and how she might work with them. And I think, yeah, that this awareness and sensitivity to the world about her and her ability to seek creative solutions for different environments and situations that would be difficult. And I think as her kind of legacy, I think that thing about not needing to be the expert is absolutely true. And also this kind of willful charging into the unknown, this kind of, yeah. And that's, thank you.
So thank you so much for your presentations that were so illuminating and gave 5 different perspectives and insights. Have we got mics for people on the floor? Before we fully open it up for people to share their insights and thoughts their own way, there's 2 people I would really, really love to hear from, and you'll see why when they start sharing with us. They're 2 people that Rose has entrusted with her artworks and her estate and her legacy on her death, and so the 2 of them are forming the future of Rose's influence. So they have a very pivotal role at what's also a difficult time to people close to Rose. So Beth Derbyshire, I'd love to hear from in a minute, I'll do tinier intros, and also Andre Cook. Andre worked very closely with Stephanie and I on the exhibition, and we literally couldn't and wouldn't have done it without her, and we're super grateful, it's been amazing. So first, we're going to ask Beth to speak to us all. So I'm going to say a few words about Beth, just to give you a little context. So Beth's a multidisciplinary visual artist, and she's worked in many innovative ways in the public realm. And she's embraced a broad range of subjects, from war, remembrance, nationality and the environment. And she's delivered a wide range of projects over the last 16 years, working with lots of different communities, not the skateboard community, deaf communities, and military planners, refugee and veteran groups, and a huge broad swathe of people she's met through the different projects and spaces that she's worked in. And she's also done city-wide projects in London and Montreal, which have resulted in events and performances and film, artworks and intervention through urban landscapes. So Beth, would you share with us?
Hello everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank our speakers. I think you've all spoken so beautifully about Rose, and to thank MoMA for such a great exhibition. But really importantly, I would also really like to thank Andre, who is the artistic executor. I sort of take care of the estate in a different way, and you've done a terrific job and are doing such a great job. So I really want to begin with that. So I just came, I'm not going to be as eloquent as you. I've made a couple of notes about Rose. I met Rose in 1996 at Chelsea College of Art in Bagley's Lane, and I can remember it distinctly. She had bright red lipstick, she had a cold and a cup of tea and a woolly hat on. And a bit like you, maybe I had a pretty exacting first tutorial. So, and Rose became obviously a great friend to me, and so I'm not sure it'll be as well versed as everyone has beautifully spoken about, but I can say a few things. So Rose for me was, in fact it's interesting because I was a student here at Ruskin, and so it's interesting for me coming back because when I left Ruskin I'd had a great journey there, and then I had a gap, and in that gap before I went to Chelsea I didn't know if I was going to be an artist. I just couldn't quite work it out. I'd had 3 or 4 years being in art school, but how was I going to make a living, and my parents were coming down pretty heavily on me. And actually my friend that I brought today with me to see the exhibition said, what did Rose mean to you? And I sort of said unflinchingly, a complete change of direction. And in fact it was Rose and her influence and the opening up of all the things that happened during that MA year that really convinced me to become an artist. I'm still a practicing artist. I lead 2 MA courses at Birmingham School of Art. And I often find myself sometimes in tutorials thinking, I can't believe, I also have imposter syndrome, thinking, gosh, here I am. And I think a lot of that is due to that important moment of meeting Rose in particular, because she was very influential, as clearly to all of us. So a few things really to say. I always think that Rose found, the extraordinary in the ordinary, and the ordinary in the extraordinary. And one of the things, picking up on 2 of the things that we talked about, so Hermione, the studio, I remember Rose taking me to the studio, but I remember on the way her taking me to the bridge, underneath the bridge at Hammersmith, and she said, you've got to, and we stood there for 10 minutes and we just listened to the cars go over, and it sounded like waves, or swimming, when she would say, well, I swim, and I, of course, was trying to do lengths and go as fast as I could to get as fit as I could. And Rose said, oh, I don't do that, I go as slow as I can under the water. And so she always sort of did things very, very differently. I think the other thing, a few other things to say, how important travel was to Rose, how it influenced her work, context or materials, obviously, that inspired her work. She also, the thing I always remember about Rose is that she constantly say, you've got to try things out, and we've all touched on this. This is one of her great expressions. And she just, and I think Andre, one of the things we found, didn't we, when we unpacked parts of Rose's flat, were extraordinary examples of previous drawings and works that's stunning, where she just tried and tried and tried again. So I think that was a huge, and I, in my practice, it's still very, very important to me. And she'd also have this expression, you might ring up and she'd say, oh, I've been dobbing about. And, what's, and in a way, so what does that mean? But in a way, Rose was sort of meaning I'd done nothing, or I'd just been doing nothing at home. But in a way, it spoke to me of the way that her process of practice was always present in the narratives that she was engaged with. So even if she wasn't sort of actively, if she was dobbing about, she was still processing and thinking. And then I think, she had an incredibly, an enduring patience. She helped friends, myself, absolutely. My mother died the year that I met Rose. And Rose was an incredible support to me in that regard, and I think with many friends in sharing happiness and also going through painful situations and really being patient about that. The last two things I think I really want to pick up on is that she also says in the film where she really, about Angel, that one of the things she liked about Angel was the way that the kids were telling their grandparents about Angel because they didn't understand what emoticon was, and she talks about the fact that she likes the switch of education of roles, and she was a great teacher. But one of the things she always talked to me about was how she was influenced by the people she taught, not necessarily myself, I hasten to say, but many of the people that were around her. She did talk about that. And a strange thing happened, which is actually shortly after Rose died, my partner and I bought a house in Herefordshire. And one of the last projects, I don't know if it was, Andre, you have to remind me, that Rose was thinking about doing, or she'd researched it, was a church at Kilpeck with the gargoyles, which happens to be 3 miles from where the house that we bought is. And we went to Kilpeck not long after Rose's death, and we went, and it is an amazing, it's a church which is 1,000 years old, and it has these gargoyles on it, and really, and what's strange about them is that they look like emoticons. And so something else that I think the Rose talks about in Angel is talking about something ancient and something new. And it was something that so it was quite a sort of spooky thing to happen. But really, just to finish, which is, she was an extraordinary person. She could be a bit difficult at times, but I mean that with a big smile on my face, only in the right way. And I think what I think is great, which is happening tonight, is that we're all brought together by Rose and her work, and the shared qualities that seem to come through. So thank you again for putting on the exhibition, and I'd also like us all to congratulate Andre on everything you've done for her work. It's brilliant.
I'll give a very brief introduction to Andre. Sorry to do this to you. But it's probably so you can kind of get a bit of a sense as to why Andre and Beth are good choices for Rose to have entrusted her work to. So Andre is a curator, and she's a commissioner of contemporary art and design. She's produced some very significant collections of work by designers such as Bourg Juntin, I can't say that, Ultimo Grito, Studio Manic and Bay, and Hussein Chalayan, and Susan Ciccolino. And key artists, commissions that she's worked with include Lawrence Weiner, Matt Collishaw, Peter Friel, Nigel Cook, George Shaw, Julian Waring, Linda, Ming Wong, and Liam Gillick. And one thing she's very known for was in '93 founding the British Council Window Gallery in Prague, which closed in 2003. And during that period, the new commissions received global critical acclaim and recognition. And she also knew Rose extremely well. So,
hello, everybody. And as Beth echoed, thank you so much for the opportunity to actually hear everybody talking about Rose from many different angles, which is, it's wonderful actually for me to have the opportunity to sit back for a moment and hear other people talk. So I am completely unplanned. I was not particularly expecting to say anything. So this is completely off the cuff. So many things are resonating as you were all talking, and I'm mindful that we're really talking tonight about kind of influence, and particularly since Rose's death, obviously tasked with managing her estate, I think about influence and legacy pretty much on a daily basis in relation to Rose. One of the things I was thinking on a personal basis is when I first met Rose, we both actually had rented the showroom, what was the showroom gallery. And I trained at art school, I had been at St Martin's, and I was renting the front of the space, and she was renting the back of the space at the time, and she was starting to build the steam machine, which we looked at this evening. Anyway, we got to know each other because we happened to live in a similar part of town, which was absolutely nowhere near where the studio was. And so we had car journeys every day, backwards and forwards to the studio. So over the years, we got to know each other very well. I then as you've just heard, really became a curator and ran galleries for most of my professional life, which is kind of what I do. And unlike most of the people that have talked tonight, I talked very little with Rose about her artwork throughout our friendship. We purposely didn't talk about art, actually. We went to see lots of shows and we talked about other people's work, but I very rarely talked to her about her work. So when she asked me to look after her legacy, it came as a bit of a shock, to be honest. Partly also because it was such a compliment and I felt the weight of this incredible career and personality that she was. And had to think about that a while, because I thought, okay, you know, if I take this on, I take it on with the seriousness of her practice, which was really considerable. And so I feel very honoured, actually, to have been asked to do this job, for want of a better word. And in thinking about her influence and her legacy, what I'm struck by actually is both the choices that she made very consequentially about not being part of a commercial gallery system and the type of practice she had, and how difficult, unfortunately, it still is to be visible as a female artist, and what legacy means in both the public and the commercial sector. I thought it was really interesting through the range of the discussions tonight, how much or how little has changed, actually, and how to represent her and her work, because also, even in putting this survey show together, there are many pieces here, as Beth also alluded to, that Rose probably never would have chosen to show you. She wouldn't have wanted you to see the back workings. And in thinking about her work and looking at it, and also talking with close friends and colleagues of hers, it was quite a conundrum as to whether one should show some of the pieces that you see here. But actually we came to the conclusion it was very important to do that, because most people would see the immaculate final image that she wanted you to see, and that's really important. But if you don't see the back workings, I don't think you understand the rigorousness of the process, or the doubt, or the anger, or all the things that actually make up her practice. So, because this is just sort of off the top of my head, really what I'm struck by is thinking about how do we maintain her legacy? How do we make sure that her influence is key? You know, for me, I'm incredibly grateful and delighted that this, I hope, is the first of the beginnings of that sort of survey of her here. For me, you know, my goal, my ambition is I want to see a full museum show. I want to see a lot of the really large-scale pieces that we've seen tonight being shown, because I think it's very hard to understand the lengths she went to and the ambition, not for the sake of ambition, but for the sake of interest, delight and perseverance in the things she was engaged with in her life. And the breadth of that, I think it's really hard to understand that fully without actually standing in front of some of the very large-scale pieces. So I'm really pleased that we have one of those here. And even that is an interesting conundrum, as we can also talk about with the curators, how to show large-scale installations where there actually isn't the kind of checklist of exactly how it should be done, because Rose would have decided at the time in a contemporary situation how to tweak things and manifest things. So those are interesting debates about inspiration and legacy in themselves. And on a personal note, I guess what I have been very struck by in managing her estate and taking that position is how in a way she's brought me back to being the artist that I originally was when I first knew her, that I feel that I have somehow become a channel of thinking again. And so sometimes in a slightly mocking, funny way, I kind of think, God damn it, you've brought me back to being in the artist position again. And as somebody who often sits on the other side of that, in a kind of gallery director type of role, that's a very interesting position to be in. So I think that's it for now.
Super. Thanks so much. So for the next 30 minutes, or a bit less, it'd be really great to hear other people's thoughts and comments. If you could be so kind as to use the mic, because it's being recorded, and if you are comfortable with, say who you are and make that connection point for everyone else, so we can kind of follow the conversation around a bit. So who would like to join in the conversation?
No pressure.
You don't have to talk for 10 minutes.
Hi. I'm just going to say it's her sense of humour that really came through in the exhibition, and I'd never heard of her before. I work at the Tate. I'm a guide. I volunteer. I take people around on tours, but and I think I'd recognise her magpie piece maybe, but never heard of her. So I'm just interested in her sense of humour really, because I laughed out loud looking at some of the pieces.
Yeah, she loved when at her funeral my sons read out 2 cracker jokes. I was trying to remember. One of them was, what did the... hold on, I always get jokes wrong. Yeah, what did the doctor say, knock knock? No, it wasn't that. It was, what did the 0 say to the 8? Nice belt. And the other one, I'll remember the other one if I remember. I did think about writing a joke for tonight, actually. No, don't worry. But she had a fantastic sense of humour, and she had this sort of slight self-mocking in the most, I think you were sort of alluding to that sense of how she was very aware of perhaps the absurdity of being an artist. Yes.
When you were doing
The Pace to Pray.
Yeah.
and Bounty, I drink that, and the way she just explained. Yeah, but that was it. I just say
Yeah.
very, very witty.
Yeah.
There's some aspects of the type of humour that Rose had that kind of came through the work, and the more we looked, the more that was very apparent. It would get used very much as a form, arguably as almost aesthetic form sometimes. Fluxus artists would use it a lot as well. This idea that you can have something that's actually really a distilled concept that's been worked through really carefully and presented as something quite light. And some of the thinking and theory around that form of humour is that it enables you to think about big ideas, but in quite a light way, because it kind of offers out insights or ideas in a way that gives you lots of space to engage with them, essentially mentally. And it comes through a few different forms of contemplative...
Inviting in the audience. It's not saying, this is the work.
Yeah.
It's saying, come and... it's the quietness of the word that I really appreciate, that sense of being... You're almost co-conspirators instead of viewers, which is that is also such a rare thing.
Can I ask Andre, did Rose leave any instructions as to how her archive should be looked after and displayed, and what you should show and what you shouldn't show? Did she have any instructions for you?
Her actual archive, she'd started a discussion with Tate about the purchase of it. I don't know how many months or perhaps a year or so before she became ill. Actually, she'd already started putting an archive together, and of course, true to form, it was very mannered in terms of what should be there and what shouldn't be there. And again, I worked with very close friends of hers to try to work out what we thought she would have wanted. So there wasn't any actual instruction she gave, because unfortunately her illness was such that it became quite hard for her to communicate quite quickly. So those discussions, we didn't ever have the opportunity for them. But while I was able, I sort of asked her enough information to give me kind of some base ground that, of course, you realise, particularly with the larger scale pieces, or pieces which are not, you know, a static piece of art on the wall, that there are some unanswered questions. So we sort of are working to piece those together, kind of, I would say, almost as a community of friends and colleagues as we go along, really.
But that process of doing that meant that a lot of, in order to generate the material for that did mean, didn't it, that she had spent time sorting through what she wanted and tidying it up.
I mean, catalogue which she produced with Riding House the year before she died, or was published the year before she died, it actually took her 10 years to put it together with Herman Lely. Certainly is her indication of her kind of bibliography and what she wanted people to see. I think personally there's a much bigger story and a much broader Rose, which would also be interesting, I hope, for scholars to pick up on and academics, and to really enjoy the breadth of everything she did.
Hello, my name is Mark Dunhill. I did meet Rose many, many years ago when I started teaching at Maidstone College of Art. We're talking a hell of a long time ago, in about 1977, I guess. She would have been working with the film and video department there, David Hall. A lot has been said about the influence that Rose has had on other people and students and so on, but nothing yet about her early life and about who would have influenced her. What was she drawing on? What was she being influenced by? I'm also interested to think about some of her contemporaries, someone like Helen Chadwick perhaps, and this kind of overlaps. Again, someone very obsessed with detail and a certain kind of breadth of practice and so on. And so I just wonder if the panel have got thoughts about the period that formed Rose's ideas and the influences that would have kind of impinged on that.
It's hard to say. I mean, there was an explosion of performance art in America that started with the Woman House at Cal Arts in California, where women took over an entire building and a whole series of performances took place there. There was a lot of make-up performances in those, Leah's room, there was a sort of menstruation room, there were all kinds of, the idea of completely reassembling a room to your own purposes was something that came, I think, from there. And we were all aware of the work. Lucy Lippard's book on women artists came over, and Julie Chicago's work was an influence as well. I mean, there's see a meticulous artwork. And then there was Carolee. There was Carolee doing quite extreme works. And I think that Rose was sort of positioning herself between that and what was a much more academic framework that was coming through some of the Marxist critiques. And then there were two kinds of feminism. There was radical feminism and then there was Marxist feminism, and the Marxists tended to say you can't show your body, and that was there was a lot of sort of feminist taboo about at the same time, and there were these two factions. And so I think that she spent a lot of time trying to work out exactly where she might fit within that argument and how her own practice might function. But Helen Chadwick was a friend of hers, wasn't she? I mean, they were aware of each other's work. Sonia was doing extraordinary performances, which were based on her Irish heritage and the Troubles in Ireland. one of the performances that Sonia did was walking through barbed wire, which was something that I think all of us found extremely powerful. So, I mean, I think that there was just this constellation of feminist work that was becoming more and more visible. But there was the American versus the British, and I think Rose felt that she was somewhere in between. I read in her interview with you, Hermione, which was wonderful. I mean, there was something she said that struck me, and she said, "I don't feel that I belong in the way I used to feel. I used to feel I belonged to something that was central and that was important." And then you ask her, in the 70s, and she says yes. So I wanted to actually find out from you what you feel she then became identified with, because there was this ageism, and she did slightly stand back from her earlier involvement in feminism. And I wrote a piece about her once called "In Praise of Older Women." And it was about her and Kate Mennell, and I understand that she was furious about this. So if that feminist context, politics change, disappeared, where do you feel she placed herself? I mean, I've heard that she placed herself very firmly within a teaching environment and with certain colleagues, but what do you think the larger argument of her work?
I think it was hugely complicated because, and that's why I opened with the anecdote about refusing to give her age in the Saatchi show, because of course she was thrilled to have that level of exposure, but then it was quite clear that she wasn't in the same category as other people in that exhibition. But it didn't matter because somehow experiencing the work was more important. But I mean, I was going to ask you, I think, about going back further perhaps than the framing of her work within feminism. Not that it's not important, but that actually she would speak, for instance, a great deal about Derek Bourchier, about Eve Klein when she did the whole piece that it was in here about squeezing your ego, and actually the sort of engagement with ideas did predate that somehow in her mind, in her experience anyway. And she was very, very delighted, to always get presents from Derek. A ruler, I think, was sent through the post from Derek Bourchier with a stamp on it.
I sent that, actually.
Oh, it was you who sent that. There were other things that she got, cards and things from Derek Bourchier, and she was very pleased about that. And I think he was saying about Ed Ruscha that...
So it's interesting, actually,
really
you saying that reminded me of another conversation we'd had about other female performance artists and almost like a revisionist history of how performance is then shown as a product or for a market to buy work, and how that then diminishes the very thing that
was radical about it.
Yes, and the very thing, you sort of distill it down to a thing rather than it being the experience. And I think, and I forgive me if I'm projecting slightly, but I feel that she was much more interested in the experience than the object in terms of performance.
But I think that actually that was still difficult for her as towards the end of her life, and I think that she did feel quite at odds about who to affiliate herself with, and how to frame what she did. And I mean the work of the public art work that she did, which was one of the many unrealized projects which she worked very closely with her. With the map pins, and she did feel that if she could work with public art, that was another way of framing her practice, and I think she welcomed that very much.
And there were those large commissions like TSWA and things that artists were getting involved in terms of that public art move to public art, I guess, that was very much part of that context. And also I was thinking about people speaking to me more about the sort of legacy of a certain time in the
60s and 70s where you would only, there's sort of didacticism of certain sorts of forms of feminism and sense of political work, that you could only work with phototext, or you couldn't possibly be a feminist and a painter, or you couldn't possibly really be that interested in stuff, maybe, because there was this kind of break between the conceptual and the material. And I think all those binaries, which I suppose was what I was trying to address as well, because I think that they always re-emerge as positions. And I think it's really difficult. I think all artists are trying to sort of position themselves in these very categories that start off being freedoms and then they become orthodoxies. And they absolutely close down the very thing that they were meant to be opening up.
I think one of the things that was really interesting about Rose is that she emerged at a time when medium specificity was something that everybody adopted, that filmmakers were into celluloid and performance was something that you never collected, that it was a rejection of the whole notion of the art market itself. But you could never pigeonhole her in any way at all. She was quite fugitive, wasn't she? And that's something that became quite orthodox later on. So I think she was really ahead of her time in that respect.
Very much so.
But hence the task of her legacy and how to frame her work becomes increasingly complicated.
Well, I think coming back to your question about kind of what influenced her, I think actually context, generally, the context of life interested her. I mean, in each of the decades, she was interested and very influenced by the artists around her. During the kind of the YBA shows, when there was this sort of interest and resurgence in British art, which had been, quite off the map before then. Of course, she was hugely complimented to be part of that, but also very influenced by her contemporaries, who would have been, younger than her at the time, doing very different things, but kind of taking that in, as well as reading from the Book of Miracles or going down her street and being interested, when she did the piece at Bow Angel that you saw, completely immersing herself in that community, I mean, in a very diligent way. So I think she was completely influenced by the context of life in front of her, and saw that from both an art perspective, but both, people's thinking, the literature of the time, the religion or the spiritual thinking that was going on, and obviously one can look at her work, I think, through a very personal lens of her own history and drawing that out. But given that nobody really talks about that in relation to her work or has mapped that, I feel a bit shy to discuss that, but obviously I think there's, as there is with most artists' work, a huge personal thread as well that runs through it all.
She did a very, very lengthy interview with Lisa Tickner that was published in the Oxford Art Journal in 1980. And there was...
she was absolutely
which caused quite a few problems. But there was something in there. I did actually read it again. I thought, I must find out. But she talked about the importance of other women, and she said that they were penetrating the edges of language. And she said that she desperately needed other women to do the same, so that you can be learning from the bits they pull apart. So I think that community, and that's really the sense that I get, that she managed to maintain shifting communities around her throughout her life, even down to somebody saying, she knew everybody in the shops as well, that seemed to be very important to her. And I think that's quite... But this notion of not fitting in anymore is still something that bothers me slightly.
I think it extended right until through when she began to get ill, she didn't want it to be generally known, and all of us, the friends around her, were only communicated towards her, not with each other. So it took a long time for her to sort of allow us to sort of work together. And I think again that's sort of testament to how she did feel quite on a limb, out on a limb.
How sensitive do you think she was to criticism? Because in one of the interviews, either with you or with Lisa, she talks about being quite upset by men being aggressive when she presented a very early performance, that they didn't like her standing up and saying and doing things that were out of character for what this particular person decided was appropriate for a woman to do.
I think intensely sensitive about it. Yeah, very.
Funny that you say that. I mean, I always thought she was very robust, actually. I mean, in the way that anybody is upset by criticism. But actually, I think she held a very strong position about her voice, about the female voice, about her work in an art context and practice, and was very professional about that stance, although personally probably felt very hurt by it. But I don't think that's, I don't think more than most people personally would.
She does reveal in one of the interviews that her father, he sounded a bit of a tyrant, and that he didn't expect her mother or herself and her sister to have any opinions, certainly that differed from his own. And that apparently whenever, is it with you, did she say all that if a woman came to the house who then seemed a strong personality, he would go out of his way to belittle her as a signal to his daughter that he didn't expect her to behave like this. So I think if you've had that for years and years, he presumably was a Catholic.
Do you think it's generational?
Well, I mean, if you're brought up with that,
It sounds very familiar
it's
with
going to have a kind of an impact,
my
I think.
family, in terms of how the generations shift and what was once potentially, and I'm not saying it was acceptable, but in its time was how people behaved. There's sort of how things do change, thankfully.
But I think, again, it depends how you choose to look at things. I mean, she had, she was in she had a religious upbringing. She went to, maybe Beth, you have to qualify this, but she went to a boarding school at one point, run by nuns. And one of the things that I was recently told that I didn't know is that sometimes at mealtimes they had to wear white gloves. And they obviously prayed every day. And actually looking at It Pays to Pray kind of puts an interesting shift on that piece if you look at it through that lens. Because obviously in her upbringing there was, you know, you have to pray, and if you don't pray, no doubt, it's going to be very bad for you. But she turns that on its head with a witticism about spirituality and food. And were you going to say something?
I was just going to add something in. Just to add to this, that I think that one of the things that Rose did, which was that she, with a difficult situation, she'd apply a filter to it, so that I think who said it, something magical came out of when the ship, Hermione, you said it, when she'd get to the end of a project, or there would be a moment where the project's appearing to sink or go wrong, and then she would pull a phoenix out of the ashes. And I think that was very important. That was really a big part of the way Rose operated, and helped you think that, and it's part of process as an artist, that it just goes on, it doesn't really stop, and failure, as we know, is really important. So just to add into that point. So.
And yes, that maybe in the framing of seemingly adverse situations, that you put a different spin on it. I think that was the point I was trying to make, so that I think in some ways she protected her personal life, and she augmented it so that the themes that mattered to her, spirituality, education, came out in a very clever way, I think, that was much broader and bigger than just her own position. And that's why I think the work is very universal and has a wide reach, and why her legacy, I think, is so important, that actually it speaks to many of us in different ways. And the fact that, you know, you were talking about before, that you laugh out loud, one laughs out loud when you go to It Pays to Pray. See some of the slogans that are thrown back to you, which are about insecurity, are about consuming in a funny, perhaps self-belittling or over-gratifying way is part of the kind of language of some of that kind of, some of the adversity that we all face in life, but wish to think about differently. Anyway, I think I haven't expressed the end of that very well.
I think that's a very beautiful point to end on.
I was just wondering whether Sonia might have something to say.
Exactly.
Sonia, are you happy to speak to us?
You knew her long before we did, Sonia.
Well, yeah. My goodness, I've known Rose for, well, I suppose I met her in about 1974, which probably isn't all that long. And I don't know, I have no idea of time these days. And yeah, we met at the women's collective actually, and it was part of, at that time, no, it wasn't part of the, no, we met at the women's collective just a couple of years before you, Kate, actually, it wasn't too long. And, but Rose and I were pretty well friends until she died, really, apart from a few years. And I always thought, I think she's much more sensitive. I think she's a very, very sensitive person. And probably much more sensitive than anyone thinks, really, that she would put over in a way. And I actually think that, oh, my words to describe her are so ridiculous at the moment. They're sort of like magical, and I think that was a word you used, which was very beautiful. And I do think, when I think of her work and her herself, I think of beauty. That's the word that comes to mind for me. And I love that word. And although people really berate it these days. But Rose was a great friend, and actually I was the friend we used to go, she and I used to go around all the shops in Soho. And yeah, we had, I think but then before I knew her, she was working earlier than I was, and she went through the whole thing of the 60s. And I think I didn't know her when she did her flags. And I always wondered about those. And actually, this show has really shown me, I'm so glad to see them, because they really showed me a lot more about them and their meanings. But I think there was an awful lot of the 60s culture in her, really, quite before the women's thing, because I think she didn't really become part of the women's movement until about 1970, until we met up at the collective, actually. And I mean, that was a terrific time for women in those days, because we were exploring things that seemed so alive and so new to us all. And there was a terrific feeling of energy around the place. And just taking part in this wonderful new feeling, this sort of almost ecstasy sort of feeling, where things were sort of brilliant and fresh, and I don't really know what to say. But, and so we all had that feeling, and so I suppose that's what you mean by, someone said there was a difference in her life before that period and after. Because I don't think anyone really forgets that period easily. And I have no words to describe what I feel, really, or even what people want me to say. But she's I just think she was a wonderful friend, and I really value every minute of her. And I value so much seeing people here who I actually didn't know before, and who were Rose's friends too. And really chokes me up a little bit. But I just loved her, and I think she expressed love. She had that. She gave everyone so much attention. I think that was what was so wonderful for her, because she had so many friends, and she just gave everyone her attention. But she was very sensitive, and she was, with her work, she was very, very prickly about what people would say about it, I think. And yeah, she knew where she was going, and she knew what she wanted people to feel about her. And she was. She had so many things. She was very solid about her work, I would say, as well. Because you don't think solid would be a word that would describe Rose, but because she was totally the opposite of that to look at. But I think there was something very determined about her, and very focused about her projects, but also about her life in general. Although with all the masses of things that would go wrong, you would never believe it. But you know, she was very. She had a love of life, I guess.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for sharing the love of life and the brilliant, generous, different qualities of Sonia. Thank you.